I used to believe that if a man worked hard enough and saved enough money he could protect the people he loved from anything life might bring. The morning I turned 71 I woke up believing I had done exactly that. My name is Harold Bennett and by every practical measure I had lived a successful life. I owned 3 homes across the state of Illinois, including the quiet brick house where I had spent the last 20 years. I had investments carefully managed by people who spoke in calm, confident voices about markets and returns. My bank account held more than $14 million, and every financial advisor I had ever hired told me the same thing. Harold, you are secure for the rest of your life. That morning the sun rose slowly over my backyard and the light came through the kitchen window just the way it always had. I made my coffee the same way I had for decades and stood by the counter looking out at the oak tree in the yard while the house stayed quiet around me. Birthdays feel different when you reach 71. You stop thinking about what is ahead and begin thinking about what remains behind you. Yet I was not unhappy that morning. In fact, I felt something close to satisfaction. I had spent 45 years building my business from a small construction company with 1 pickup truck into something large enough that I could sell it and retire comfortably. I had worked early mornings and late nights. I had missed plenty of family dinners and more than a few holidays. But I always told myself it was worth it because everything I was building would one day belong to the person who mattered most to me. My son Daniel. Daniel Bennett was 38 years old that year, and the truth is that he was the one thing in my life that made all the years of work feel meaningful. When he was a boy he used to follow me around construction sites wearing a hard hat that was much too big for him. He would ask questions about everything. Why the cranes moved the way they did. Why concrete had to dry before the next wall could be built. Why grown men argued about blueprints as if they were trying to solve the greatest puzzle in the world. I remember thinking even back then that one day the company might belong to him. But life rarely moves according to the plans we quietly design in our heads. Daniel grew up to be very different from the young version of myself. He studied social work instead of business and chose to spend his career helping teenagers who had nowhere else to turn. At first I did not understand that decision. I had spent my life building something solid while he seemed determined to give his time to people who could offer nothing in return. Yet over the years I came to respect him for it because there was a kind of quiet strength in the way he cared about others. That morning on my 71st birthday I expected to see him later in the evening. He had promised to stop by after work with his wife Rachel and we were going to have a simple dinner together. Nothing extravagant. Just the 3 of us sitting around the dining table the way families sometimes do when life slows down long enough to allow it. I remember glancing at the clock on the kitchen wall sometime after 9 that night. The house was dark except for the lamp beside my chair and I had just begun to wonder if traffic had delayed them. Then the phone rang. At my age you learn that a phone call late at night almost never carries ordinary news. I answered it anyway and heard a voice on the other end that spoke carefully as if every word had been measured before it was allowed to leave the mouth. In that moment I understood something without fully hearing it yet. All the houses I owned. Every dollar sitting quietly in the bank. None of it meant anything anymore because the world I thought I had built was about to change in a way no amount of money could ever repair. I remember the silence after that voice finished speaking. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air inside the room has suddenly changed and you cannot quite breathe the same way anymore. The man on the phone introduced himself as a state police officer and spoke slowly, carefully, as if he had done this many times before. He explained that my son Daniel had been involved in a serious car accident on Interstate 90 earlier that evening while driving home from work. For a moment I simply stood there with the phone pressed against my ear, staring at the kitchen wall as if the clock hanging there might suddenly rewind the day. I asked the officer the only question that mattered to me, but the answer came back with a kind of quiet certainty that left no room for misunderstanding. Daniel had not survived. Even now I can still remember the way those words seemed to echo through the house after the call ended. I did not shout and I did not drop the phone. I simply placed it back on the counter and stood there for several seconds without moving. The kitchen still smelled faintly of coffee and the lamp beside the sink cast the same soft yellow light across the floor. Everything in the room remained exactly as it had been before the phone rang, and yet nothing felt the same. When a man reaches 71 years of age, he believes he has already faced the hardest moments life can deliver. I had buried my parents decades earlier. I had watched friends grow old and disappear one by one from the circle of people who once filled my life with familiar voices. But no one prepares you for the moment when you hear that your child is gone. Parents are not supposed to outlive their children. That is a rule so deeply woven into the order of the world that when it breaks, something inside you struggles to understand how life can continue moving forward afterward. I remember walking slowly through the house after the call, turning off lights that suddenly seemed unnecessary. The dining table was still set for 3 people because I had expected Daniel and Rachel to arrive that evening. 3 plates sat neatly beside 3 glasses, and a simple chocolate cake rested in the center of the table with 71 small candles waiting beside it in a box. I had bought that cake that afternoon at a bakery only a few blocks away, smiling politely at the young woman behind the counter when she asked if it was for a special occasion. I told her it was my birthday and that my son was coming over for dinner. It seemed important to say that out loud at the time, as if sharing the moment with a stranger made it feel more real. Now I stood there looking at the empty chairs and understood that dinner was never going to happen. A few minutes later the phone rang again. This time it was Rachel. Her voice sounded fragile and distant, as if she were speaking from somewhere very far away even though the hospital was less than 20 miles from my house. She told me she was there and that I should come if I could. I did not hesitate. I grabbed my car keys from the kitchen counter and walked out into the cool night air. The neighborhood street was quiet and the porch light cast a small circle of brightness across the driveway. As I started the engine of my car, I realized something strange about the way my mind was working in that moment. I had spent most of my life making decisions quickly and confidently. Running a business required that kind of certainty. Yet now as I pulled onto the empty road and began driving toward the hospital, I understood that every mile ahead of me was carrying me closer to a reality I was not ready to face. The numbers in my bank account had once made me feel prepared for anything the future might bring, but during that drive across town I began to understand a truth that would follow me for the rest of my life. There are moments when money cannot buy time, cannot repair loss, and cannot return the person you love most in the world. I arrived at the hospital a little after 10:30 that night. The parking lot was half empty and the bright lights above the entrance made everything look colder than it should have been. Hospitals always feel strange late at night because the world outside becomes quiet while inside the building life continues moving forward with an urgency that never seems to stop. I remember parking my car and sitting there for a moment with both hands resting on the steering wheel. The engine was still running but I did not move. Somewhere inside that building my son was waiting, and even though I already knew what the officer had told me, some part of my mind still hoped there had been a mistake. When I finally stepped out of the car, the air felt sharp and cool against my face. I walked through the glass doors and immediately saw Rachel sitting in a chair near the waiting area. She looked smaller than I remembered, almost as if the long hours of that night had taken something from her that could never be replaced. Her eyes were red and tired, and when she saw me she stood up slowly without saying a word. For a moment we simply looked at each other across the quiet room. Rachel and I had never been especially close, but she had been part of my family for nearly 12 years. She and Daniel met during graduate school and married a few years later in a small ceremony near Lake Michigan. Daniel had looked happier that day than I had ever seen him before, and Rachel had always carried herself with a kind of steady warmth that made people feel comfortable around her. Seeing her standing there alone in the hospital waiting room felt deeply wrong, like a scene from someone else's life that I had accidentally walked into. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me in a silent embrace. I could feel her shoulders shaking slightly as she tried to control her breathing. Neither of us spoke because there were no words that could make sense of what had happened. After a few seconds she gently stepped back and motioned toward a quiet hallway where a doctor was waiting. The doctor introduced himself politely and spoke in a calm professional tone. He explained that Daniel had been brought in earlier that evening and that the medical team had done everything they could. I listened carefully to every word even though the meaning had already been clear since the moment the officer called. At some point during the conversation Rachel reached over and held my hand. It was a small gesture but it reminded me that she had lost something that night as well. Daniel had been her husband, her partner, the person she had planned to build the rest of her life with. Grief does not belong to one person alone. When the doctor finished speaking he asked if we would like a few minutes of privacy before completing the necessary paperwork. Rachel nodded quietly and the doctor stepped away, leaving us standing in the quiet hallway. For several moments neither of us moved. I found myself looking at the polished floor tiles as if they might provide some kind of answer that the rest of the world could not. Eventually Rachel spoke in a soft voice that sounded almost unfamiliar. She said that Daniel had been on his way home from a youth center meeting earlier that evening. Apparently he had stayed late helping a group of teenagers finish a community project they had been working on for weeks. Hearing that did not surprise me. My son had always believed that if you had the ability to help someone, then you had a responsibility to try. As we stood there in the hallway, I began to understand something that would take much longer to fully accept. Daniel had spent his life giving his time to others, while I had spent most of mine chasing financial success. That night inside the hospital I realized that the things I had once considered my greatest accomplishments suddenly felt very small compared to the life my son had quietly built around kindness and purpose. Viet fan 4 bam sat ky thuet viet de training, so 2602. Kong viet tren canvas. Tip noi fan 3, no dong not nan vat va boi can, twinoi john sa cho fu hop. Chy van phong ky thuet viet tra lai ket quad lam noi dung YouTube chu kong phi bien tap nu dao dien. Tra ket qua bang tieng on, fu hop van hoa myax, don 6 du luong mai, tuet doi kong duok mo ta bao luke, kong duok goi duk, nu ko yu de tin duk ti dambo van phong and ton voi chin sach noi dung qua YouTube. Noi dung kong duok viet tat kak tu ma phi viet day du de voiceover ai doc tot duok. Mbio tun bni dung ding twin thun a with circumflex m ton ko ket quatra v kong suong dong va de ton bo ket quatra v noi dung trong cap down goak vong. Tat ca viet bang tiang on. Ko len la viet va tra ket qua, kong duok hoi gi them. Kong duok suong dong. Kong duok tau them goak Thursday 2. Kong duok 2 format lai. Phi gep ton bo noi dung ton 1 block duway not nam trong cap, va kong duok hoi bat cu gi them, they len la tra ket qua. 2 geo, kai viet bat cu part now, hei chi tra lai noi dung trian thuan tui, kong them loi dan dao, kong them loi ket, kong cta, kong hoi muon viet tip hei kong, kong chu tik meta. Chi zut ra dung don trian theo fong catch ma twa yu ka, kong them mot dong now kok. I remember the first morning after Daniel died more clearly than I remember most days of my life. The sun came through the kitchen window just like it always did, casting the same soft light across the table where the birthday dinner had been prepared the night before, but the house felt different in a way that was impossible to describe. Silence filled every room. Not the peaceful silence of an early morning but a hollow quiet that made the entire house feel unfamiliar. I made coffee out of habit even though I did not truly want it, and I stood by the counter holding the mug while staring out toward the backyard. For decades I had started my days thinking about business deals, investments, and the constant movement of money through markets and accounts. That morning none of those things felt real or important anymore. What stayed in my mind instead were memories of Daniel growing up in this very house. I could still picture him running across that backyard as a child chasing a worn-out baseball, or sitting at the kitchen counter doing homework while asking endless questions about how the world worked. Daniel had always been curious in a way that made every conversation interesting. As he grew older, that curiosity turned into something deeper. He began volunteering in community programs when he was still in college, spending his weekends helping families who were struggling to get back on their feet. At the time I admired his kindness but also believed he would eventually move into a more profitable career path. I had spent my entire adult life building a financial empire that eventually grew into several $1 million spread across investments, properties, and accounts. My plan had always been simple. One day Daniel would inherit everything I built and he would have the security and opportunities that many people spend their entire lives chasing. Now that plan had vanished overnight. Later that morning I received a call from a man named Thomas Grant who introduced himself as the director of the small non-profit organization where Daniel had been working for the past several years. His voice carried a mixture of sadness and respect as he told me how much Daniel had meant to the people in their community programs. He spoke about families Daniel had helped guide towards stable housing, teenagers he had mentored through difficult school years, and elderly residents who relied on Daniel to organize food deliveries and transportation to medical appointments. Listening to him describe these things made me realize that there was an entire part of my son's life that I had never fully understood. To me, Daniel had simply been working for a modest non-profit job that did not pay much money. To Thomas Grant and the people he served, Daniel had been a steady presence who quietly helped hold many lives together. Before ending the call, Thomas said something that stayed with me long after the conversation finished. He told me that Daniel used to say his father had taught him the value of building something that lasts. Daniel had simply chosen to build his legacy through people instead of investments. After I hung up the phone, I walked slowly through the living room and sat down near the same window where I had spent the previous night thinking about my life. For the first time since the hospital, I began to understand that Daniel had not left the world empty-handed the way I had feared. Instead, he had left behind a network of lives he had touched in ways that could not be measured by bank statements or property deeds. And as I sat there with the quiet house around me, another thought began forming slowly but clearly in my mind. If my son had spent his life helping people build stability and hope, perhaps the fortune I had built over 71 years still had a purpose that neither of us had ever fully imagined before. I spent most of that afternoon sitting at the same dining table where the birthday dinner had been prepared only a day earlier, but now the table had become a place for reflection instead of celebration. The sunlight moved slowly across the floor as the hours passed, and with each quiet moment my thoughts kept returning to the same realization that had begun forming in my mind since the call with Thomas Grant. For 71 years I had believed that wealth was something you built for the future of your family. Every investment I made, every property I purchased, every long meeting in office towers and conference rooms had been guided by one simple belief that one day my son would inherit the result of all that work. Now Daniel was gone, and the fortune I had spent decades building no longer had the purpose I had always imagined for it. Yet the stories Thomas had shared earlier that morning would not leave my mind. I kept thinking about the families Daniel had helped find stable housing and the young people he had guided through difficult years of school. Those were not small gestures. Those were lives that had changed direction because my son had decided to show up and care about people who needed help. Late in the afternoon, I found myself opening my laptop and searching for the website of the non-profit organization where Daniel had worked. The page was simple and modest, nothing like the polished corporate websites I had spent years reviewing in business meetings. There were photographs of volunteers standing beside families who had recently moved into new apartments, pictures of community events where children were laughing while carrying boxes of donated food, and short stories describing how the organization helped people rebuild their stability after difficult periods in life. As I read through those stories, I began recognizing something I had overlooked for years. Daniel had not chosen a small career. He had chosen a meaningful one. That evening I called the number listed on the website and left a message asking Thomas Grant if we could meet the following day. I told him there were things about Daniel's work that I wanted to understand better. The next morning I drove across the city to a modest brick building that served as the headquarters for the organization. The parking lot was small and the sign near the entrance was simple, but as soon as I stepped inside I could feel the quiet energy of people working towards something that mattered. Volunteers moved through the hallway carrying boxes of supplies while staff members spoke with visitors who had come looking for guidance or assistance. Thomas greeted me near the front desk with a handshake that felt sincere and steady. He led me into a small office where photographs of community programs covered the walls. For the next hour he told me more about Daniel's work than I had ever heard before. He described how Daniel stayed late many evenings helping families complete paperwork for housing programs, how he organized transportation for elderly residents who needed medical appointments, and how he believed every person deserved a second chance to rebuild stability in their lives. Listening to those stories felt like discovering an entire chapter of my son's life that had been quietly unfolding beyond the edges of my own busy world. When Thomas finished speaking, he looked at me gently and said something that stayed with me long after I left the building. He said that Daniel often believed one person with the right support could change the future of an entire family. As I walked back to my car later that morning, I realized that the fortune I had built was no longer waiting for a single heir. Instead, it was waiting for a new purpose, one that might allow Daniel's work to continue reaching people long after both of us were gone. I did not make the decision immediately because choices that involve an entire lifetime of work deserve careful thought. For several days after my visit to the nonprofit office, I returned to my quiet house each evening and sat near the same window where I had spent so many hours reflecting on my life. The city outside continued moving forward the way it always does. Cars passed along the street, neighbors walked their dogs, and the seasons continued their slow transition toward autumn. Yet inside the house my thoughts kept circling around the same question that had followed me since Daniel's death. What should become of everything I had built? For decades my wealth had been carefully organized into portfolios, property holdings, and investment accounts managed by professionals who spoke about growth percentages and long-term security. Those systems were designed to preserve a fortune for future generations of a family. Now the future I had planned for no longer existed in the way I had imagined. One afternoon I invited my financial advisor, a thoughtful woman named Linda Parker who had worked with me for nearly 15 years, to come by the house. We sat at the dining table with several folders of documents spread between us while she patiently reviewed the structure of my estate. She explained again how my assets were distributed and how the original plan had placed everything into a trust that would have eventually passed to Daniel. Listening to her careful explanation felt almost like reviewing the blueprint of a life that had suddenly lost its intended destination. When she finished speaking, I told her about my visit to the non-profit organization where Daniel had worked. I described the stories Thomas Grant had shared and the people whose lives had been touched by my son's dedication. Linda listened quietly without interrupting, and when I finished she leaned back slightly and asked a simple question that surprised me. She asked what I believed Daniel would want his legacy to become. I had spent years thinking about what I wanted to leave behind, but I had rarely considered the possibility that my son might have imagined something different. That evening after Linda left, I walked slowly through the house again, passing the photographs that had been placed along the hallway over the years. There was one picture of Daniel as a young boy standing proudly beside a tree he had planted during a school community project. I remembered how excited he had been that day, explaining that one small tree could grow tall enough to provide shade for people who might not even be born yet. As I stood there looking at that photograph, I began to understand something about my son that had been quietly present throughout his entire life. Daniel believed deeply in planting things that would continue helping others long into the future. The following morning I called Linda Parker again and asked her to return to the house because I wanted to discuss a different structure for my estate. When she arrived, I told her that instead of leaving my entire fortune sitting idle in financial accounts, I wanted to establish a permanent foundation in Daniel's name. The purpose of that foundation would be simple and clear. It would provide funding for housing assistance programs, education support for young people, and community resources for families who were trying to rebuild stability after difficult times. Linda listened carefully and then began outlining how such a foundation could be structured so that it would continue operating for decades. As she explained the legal framework and financial planning required to make it sustainable, I felt something inside my chest that had been missing since the night at the hospital begin to return slowly. It was not happiness because grief does not disappear so easily, but it was a sense that Daniel's story might continue shaping the world in ways neither of us had fully expected. And for the first time since my 71st birthday I understood that the fortune I had built might finally be serving the purpose it had always been meant for. I spent the next several weeks working closely with Linda Parker and a small team of legal advisors who specialized in charitable foundations, and during that time I learned something that surprised me. Creating a structure that could responsibly manage millions of dollars for the benefit of communities required the same careful planning that had once gone into building my business empire. Documents had to be drafted, long-term investment strategies had to be designed to sustain funding for decades, and clear guidelines had to be written to ensure the mission of the foundation would never drift away from the purpose it was meant to serve. Yet even though the process involved contracts and financial planning, it felt very different from the corporate work I had spent most of my life doing. This time every conversation returned to a single question. How could Daniel's belief in helping people continue long after both of us were gone? One afternoon Linda arranged a meeting at the nonprofit office with Thomas Grant and several of the program coordinators who had worked closely with Daniel. We gathered in a modest conference room with a long wooden table that had clearly seen many years of planning meetings and community discussions. On the walls there were photographs of families standing in front of their first apartments after leaving temporary shelters, students holding certificates from educational programs, and volunteers smiling beside stacks of donated food boxes. As the meeting began I explained my intention to establish the Daniel Whitaker Community Foundation and to direct a significant portion of my fortune into a permanent endowment that would support housing assistance programs, youth mentorship initiatives, and educational grants for families who needed support rebuilding their lives. For a moment the room became completely quiet. Thomas looked down at the table and took a slow breath before speaking. He said that Daniel had always believed real change happened when people were given the tools to create stability for themselves and their families. Hearing those words spoken in that room made the decision feel even more certain in my mind. Over the following days we began outlining the first programs that the foundation would support. Funding would expand the nonprofit's housing assistance program so that more families could move from temporary shelters into stable apartments. Another portion would establish scholarships for students who wanted to pursue careers in community service, social work, or education. We also planned a mentorship initiative inspired directly by Daniel's work with teenagers who needed guidance during difficult school years. As these ideas slowly took shape, I began noticing something inside myself that I had not expected. For the first time since Daniel's death, the future no longer felt empty. Instead, it began to feel like a path that extended outward through the lives of people I had never met but who might one day benefit from the work my son believed in so deeply. Several months later, the legal documents were finalized and the foundation officially launched with an endowment large enough to support programs for many decades. On the day we signed the final papers, I returned home and walked once again through the quiet house where so many memories lived. I paused in the hallway beside that old photograph of Daniel standing next to the small tree he had planted as a boy. Looking at that picture now, I realized something I had not fully understood when he first brought that tree home from the school project. Planting something meaningful often means accepting that you may never see the full shade it will one day provide. Yet that does not make the act any less important. In many ways, it makes it even more valuable. As I stood there that evening, I felt a quiet sense that Daniel's life had not simply ended on the night of my 71st birthday. Instead, the values he lived by had begun taking root in ways that would continue growing far beyond the limits of one lifetime. I did not expect the foundation to change my daily life as much as it eventually did. At first, I believed my role would be limited to signing documents, approving financial transfers, and allowing the organization to carry Daniel's name into the future. Yet within the first year, something remarkable began happening. Thomas Grant invited me to attend several community events funded by the new programs, explaining that the people benefiting from the foundation often appreciated meeting the person who had helped make the work possible. The first event took place on a mild spring afternoon at a modest apartment complex on the east side of the city. A small gathering had been organized to celebrate several families who had recently moved from temporary shelters into stable housing through the expanded assistance program. Folding chairs had been arranged in a courtyard, and children were running across the grass while volunteers set up a table with lemonade and sandwiches. As I stood there quietly observing the scene, I felt an unfamiliar mixture of emotions. For most of my life, large gatherings had meant corporate conferences or formal dinners with investors. This gathering felt entirely different. People were not discussing profits or market forecasts. They were talking about school schedules, new jobs, and the relief of finally having a safe place to sleep at night. During the short ceremony, Thomas introduced me to the families and explained that the Daniel Whitaker Community Foundation had helped provide the resources that made the housing program possible. One woman approached me afterward holding the hand of a young boy who looked to be about 8 years old. She told me that for nearly a year they had been moving between temporary shelters while she worked 2 jobs trying to stabilize their situation. The apartment they had just moved into was the first place her son could truly call home in a very long time. She thanked me in a voice that carried both gratitude and exhaustion, and then she said something that stayed with me long after the event ended. She said that people like my son had given her family a chance to begin again. Driving home that afternoon, I realized that I was finally beginning to see the world through the perspective Daniel had lived with every day. Success was not only measured by how much wealth a person accumulated. Sometimes it was measured by whether a child could fall asleep in a safe bedroom or whether a struggling parent could find the support needed to rebuild stability. Over the next several months, I attended more events organized by the foundation. I met students who received scholarships to study social work and education because they wanted to help communities the way Daniel had. I spoke with volunteers who described how mentorship programs were guiding teenagers away from difficult circumstances and toward meaningful goals. Each story felt like another small branch growing from the tree Daniel had planted through his compassion and dedication. Eventually, one quiet evening, I returned home and walked again through the hallway where his photograph still hung beside that childhood tree he once planted. The house no longer felt quite as empty as it had in the months after his death. Grief still existed, of course, because losing a child is a sorrow that never truly disappears. But alongside that grief there was now a quiet understanding that Daniel's life had created something lasting. The fortune I once believed was meant only for my family had become a tool that allowed my son's values to continue shaping lives I might never personally meet. And as I stood there looking at that photograph, I finally understood a truth that had taken 71 years to learn. Wealth can build comfortable lives, but compassion can build meaningful legacies. Daniel had understood that long before I did. Through the foundation that now carried his name, his belief in helping others would continue moving forward into the future, one family, one student, and one new beginning at a time.